The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 4, Part B. Earthquake Storms. The avalanche taluses, leaning against the walls at intervals of a mile or two, are among the most striking and interesting of the secondary features of the valley. They are from about 300 to 500 feet high, made up of huge, angular, well-preserved, unshifting boulders. And instead of being slowly weathered from the cliffs, like ordinary taluses, they were all formed suddenly and simultaneously by a great earthquake that occurred at least 3 centuries ago. And though thus hurled into existence in a few seconds or minutes, they are the least changeable of all the Sierra soil beds. Excepting those which were launched directly into the channels of swift rivers, scarcely one of their wedged and interlacing boulders has moved since the day of their creation, and though mostly made up of huge blocks of granite, many of them from 10 to 50 feet cube, weighing thousands of tons with only a few small chips, trees and shrubs make out to live and thrive on them, and even delicate herbaceous plants, Draperia, Colomia, Zauschneria, etc., soothing and coloring their wild rugged slopes with gardens and groves. I was long in doubt on some points concerning the origin of those taluses. Plainly enough they were derived from the cliffs above them, because they are of the size of scars on the wall, the rough angular surface of which contrasts with the rounded, glaciated, unfractured parts. It was plain, too, that instead of being made up of material slowly and gradually weathered from the cliffs, like ordinary taluses, almost every one of them had been formed suddenly in a single avalanche, and had not been increased in size during the last 3 or 4 centuries, for trees 300 or 400 years old are growing on them, some standing at the top, close to the wall, without a bruise or broken branch, showing that scarcely a single boulder had ever fallen among them. Furthermore, all these taluses throughout the range seemed by the trees and lichens growing on them to be of the same age. All the phenomena thus pointed straight to a grand ancient earthquake. But for years I left the question open, and went on from cañon to cañon, observing again and again, measuring the heights of taluses throughout the range on both flanks, and the variations in the angles of their surface slopes, studying the way their boulders had been assorted and related and brought to rest, and their correspondence in size with the cleavage joints of the cliffs from which they were derived, cautious about making up my mind. But at last all doubt as to their formation vanished. At 2:30 o'clock of a moonlit morning in March, I was awakened by a tremendous earthquake, and though I had never before enjoyed a storm of this sort, the strange, thrilling motion could not be mistaken, and I ran out of my cabin, both glad and frightened, shouting, "A noble earthquake! A noble earthquake!" feeling sure I was going to learn something. The shocks were so violent and varied, and succeeded one another so closely, that I had to balance myself carefully in walking, as if on the deck of a ship among waves, and it seemed impossible that the high cliffs of the valley could escape being shattered. In particular, I feared that the sheer-fronted Sentinel Rock, towering above my cabin, would be shaken down, and I took shelter back of a large yellow pine, hoping that it might protect me from at least the smaller outbounding boulders. For a minute or two the shocks became more and more violent, flashing horizontal thrusts, mixed with a few twists and battering, explosive, upheaving jolts, as if nature were wrecking her Yosemite temple and getting ready to build a still better one. I was now convinced before a single boulder had fallen that earthquakes were the talus makers, and positive proof soon came. It was a calm, moonlit night, and no sound was heard for the first minute or so, save low, muffled, underground, bubbling rumblings, and the whispering and rustling of the agitated trees, as if nature were holding her breath. Then, suddenly, out of the strange silence and strange motion, there came a tremendous roar. The Eagle Rock on the south wall, about a half a mile up the valley, gave way, and I saw it falling in thousands of the great boulders I had so long been studying, pouring to the valley floor in a free curve, luminous from friction, making a terribly sublime spectacle, an arc of glowing, passionate fire, 1,500 feet span, as true in form and as serene in beauty as a rainbow in the midst of the stupendous, roaring rock storm. The sound was so tremendously deep and broad and earnest, the whole earth, like a living creature, seemed to have at last found a voice and to be calling to her sister planets. In trying to tell something of the size of this awful sound, it seems to me that if all the thunder of all the storms I had ever heard were condensed into one roar, it would not equal this rock roar at the birth of a mountain talus. Think, then, of the roar that arose to heaven at the simultaneous birth of all the thousands of ancient cañon taluses throughout the length and breadth of the range. The first severe shocks were soon over, and eager to examine the newborn talus, I ran up the valley in the moonlight, and climbed upon it before the huge blocks, after their fiery flight, had come to complete rest. They were slowly settling into their places, chafing, grating against one another, groaning and whispering. But no motion was visible except in a stream of small fragments pattering down the face of the cliff. A cloud of dust particles, lighted by the moon, floated out across the whole breadth of the valley, forming a ceiling that lasted until after sunrise, and the air was filled with the odor of crushed Douglas spruces from a grove that had been mowed down and mashed like weeds. After the ground began to calm, I ran across the meadow to the river to see in what direction it was flowing, and was glad to find that down the valley was still down. Its waters were muddy from portions of its banks having given way, but it was flowing around its curves and over its ripples and shallows with ordinary tones and gestures. The mud would soon be cleared away, and the raw slips on the banks would be the only visible record of the shaking it suffered. The upper Yosemite Fall, glowing white in the moonlight, seemed to know nothing of the earthquake, manifesting no change in form or voice, as far as I could see or hear. After a second startling shock, about 3:30 o'clock, the ground continued to tremble gently, and smooth, hollow rumbling sounds, not always distinguishable from the rounded, bumping, explosive tones of the falls, came from deep in the mountains in a northern direction. The few Indians fled from their huts to the middle of the valley, fearing that angry spirits were trying to kill them. And, as I afterward learned, most of the Yosemite tribe, who were spending the winter at their village on Bull Creek, 40 miles away, were so terrified that they ran into the river and washed themselves, getting themselves clean enough to say their prayers, I suppose, or to die. I asked Dick, one of the Indians with whom I was acquainted, what made the ground shake and jump so much? He only shook his head and said, "No good, no good," and looked appealingly to me to give him hope that his life was to be spared. In the morning I found the few white settlers assembled in front of the old Hutchings Hotel, comparing notes and meditating flight to the lowlands, seemingly as sorely frightened as the Indians. Shortly after sunrise, a low, blunt, muffled rumbling, like distant thunder, was followed by another series of shocks, which, though not nearly so severe as the first, made the cliffs and domes tremble like jelly, and the big pines and oaks thrill and swish and wave their branches with startling effect. Then the talkers were suddenly hushed, and the solemnity on their faces was sublime. One in particular of these winter neighbors, a somewhat speculative thinker with whom I had often conversed, was a firm believer in the cataclysmic origin of the valley, and I now jokingly remarked that his wild tumble-down and engulfment hypothesis might soon be proved, since these underground rumblings and shakings might be the forerunners of another Yosemite-making cataclysm, which would perhaps double the depth of the valley by swallowing the floor, leaving the ends of the roads and trails dangling 3,000 or 4,000 feet in the air. Just then came the third series of shocks, and it was fine to see how awfully silent and solemn he became. His belief in the existence of a mysterious abyss into which the suspended floor of the valley and all the domes and battlements of the walls might at any moment go roaring down, mightily troubled him. To diminish his fears, and laugh him into something like reasonable faith, I said, "Come, cheer up! Smile a little and clap your hands, now that kind Mother Earth is trotting us on her knee to amuse us and make us good." But the well-meant joke seemed irreverent and utterly failed, as if only prayerful terror could rightly belong to the wild beauty-making business. Even after all the heavier shocks were over, I could do nothing to reassure him. On the contrary, he handed me the keys of his little store to keep, saying that with a companion of like mind he was going to the lowlands, to stay until the fate of poor, trembling Yosemite was settled. In vain I rallied them on their fears, calling attention to the strength of the granite walls of our valley home, the very best and solidest masonry in the world, and less likely to collapse and sink than the sedimentary lowlands to which they were looking for safety, and saying that in any case they sometime would have to die, and so grand a burial was not to be slighted. But they were too seriously panic-stricken to get comfort from anything I could say. During the third severe shock, the trees were so violently shaken that the birds flew out with frightened cries. In particular, I noticed 2 robins flying in terror from a leafless oak, the branches of which swished and quivered as if struck by a heavy battering-ram. Exceedingly interesting were the flashing and quivering of the elastic needles of the pines in the sunlight, and the waving up and down of the branches, while the trunks stood rigid. There was no swaying, waving, or swirling as in windstorms, but quick, quivering jerks, and at times the heavy tasseled branches moved as if they had all been pressed down against the trunk and suddenly let go, to spring up and vibrate until they came to rest again. Only the owls seemed to be undisturbed. Before the rumbling echoes had died away, a hollow-voiced owl began to hoot in philosophical tranquillity from near the edge of the new talus, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, although, perhaps, he was curious to know what all the noise was about. His hoot-to-hoot-to-hoo might have meant, "What's a the steer, Kimmer?" It was long before the valley found perfect rest. The rocks trembled more or less every day for over 2 months, and I kept a bucket of water on my table to learn what I could of the movements. The blunt thunder in the depths of the mountains was usually followed by sudden jarring, horizontal thrusts from the northward, often succeeded by twisting, up-jolting movements. More than a month after the first great shock, when I was standing on a fallen tree up the valley near Lamon's winter cabin, I heard a distinct bubbling thunder from the direction of Tenaya Cañon. Carlo, a large, intelligent St. Bernard dog standing beside me, seemed greatly astonished, and looked intently in that direction with mouth open, and uttered a low woof, as if saying, "What's that?" He must have known that it was not thunder, though like it. The air was perfectly still, not the faintest breath of wind perceptible, and a fine, mellow, sunny hush pervaded everything, in the midst of which came that subterranean thunder. Then, while we gazed and listened, came the corresponding shocks, distinct as if some mighty hand had shaken the ground. After the sharp horizontal jars died away, they were followed by a gentle rocking and undulating of the ground, so distinct that Carlo looked at the log on which he was standing to see who was shaking it. It was the season of flooded meadows, and the pools about me, calm as sheets of glass, were suddenly thrown into low, ruffling waves. Judging by its effects, this Yosemite or Inyo earthquake, as it is sometimes called, was gentle as compared with the one that gave rise to the grand talus system of the range, and did so much for the cañon scenery. Nature, usually so deliberate in her operations, then created, as we have seen, a new set of features simply by giving the mountains a shake, changing not only the high peaks and cliffs, but the streams. As soon as these rock avalanches fell, the streams began to sing new songs, for in many places thousands of boulders were hurled into their channels, roughening and half-damming them, compelling the waters to surge and roar in rapids where before they had glided smoothly. Some of the streams were completely dammed, driftwood, leaves, etc., gradually filling the interstices between the boulders, thus giving rise to lakes and level reaches, and these again, after being gradually filled in, were changed to meadows, through which the streams are now silently meandering, while at the same time some of the taluses took the places of old meadows and groves. Thus rough places were made smooth, and smooth places rough. But, on the whole, by what at first sight seemed pure confounded confusion and ruin, the landscapes were enriched. For gradually every talus was covered with groves and gardens, and made a finely proportioned and ornamental base for the cliffs. In this work of beauty every boulder is prepared and measured and put in its place more thoughtfully than are the stones of temples. If for a moment you are inclined to regard these taluses as mere draggled, chaotic dumps, climb to the top of one of them, and run down without any haggling, puttering hesitation, boldly jumping from boulder to boulder with even speed. You will then find your feet playing a tune, and quickly discover the music and poetry of these magnificent rock piles, a fine lesson. And all nature's wildness tells the same story, the shocks and outbursts of earthquakes, volcanoes, geysers, roaring, thundering waves and floods, the silent uprush of sap in plants, storms of every sort, each and all are the orderly, beauty-making love-beats of nature's heart. End of Chapter 4.
The Yosemite, by John Muir. Chapter 5. The Trees of the Valley. The most influential of the valley trees is the yellow pine, Pinus ponderosa. It attains its noblest dimensions on beds of water-washed, coarsely stratified moraine material, between the talus slopes and meadows, dry on the surface, well watered below, and where not too closely assembled in groves the branches reach nearly to the ground, forming grand spires 200 to 220 feet in height. The largest that I have measured is standing alone almost opposite the Sentinel Rock, or a little to the westward of it. It is a little over 8 feet in diameter, and about 220 feet high. Climbing these grand trees, especially when they are waving and singing in worship in windstorms, is a glorious experience. Ascending from the lowest branch to the topmost is like stepping up stairs through a blaze of white light, every needle thrilling and shining, as if with religious ecstasy. Unfortunately, there are but few sugar pines in the valley, though in the King's Yosemite they are in glorious abundance. The incense cedar, Libocedrus decurrens, with cinnamon-colored bark and yellow-green foliage, is one of the most interesting of the Yosemite trees. Some of them are 150 feet high, from 6 to 10 feet in diameter, and they are never out of sight as you saunter among the yellow pines. Their bright brown shafts and towers of flat frond-like branches make a striking feature of the landscapes throughout all the seasons. In midwinter, when most of the other trees are asleep, this cedar puts forth its flowers in millions, the pistillate pale green and inconspicuous, but the staminate bright yellow, tinging all the branches and making the trees as they stand in the snow look like gigantic goldenrods. The branches, outspread in flat plumes and beautifully fronded, sweep gracefully downward and outward, except those near the top, which aspire. The lowest, especially in youth and middle age, droop to the ground, overlapping one another, shedding off rain and snow like shingles, and making fine tents for birds and campers. This tree frequently lives more than 1,000 years, and is well worthy its place beside the great pines and the Douglas spruce. The two largest specimens I know of the Douglas spruce, about 8 feet in diameter, are growing at the foot of the Liberty Cap near the Nevada Fall, and on the terminal moraine of the small residual glacier that lingered in the shady Illilouette Canyon. After the conifers, the most important of the Yosemite trees are the oaks, 2 species. The California live oak, Quercus agrifolia, with black trunks reaching a thickness of from 4 to nearly 7 feet, wide-spreading branches and bright, deeply scalloped leaves. It occupies the greater part of the broad sandy flats of the upper end of the valley, and is the species that yields the acorns so highly prized by the Indians and woodpeckers. The other species is the mountain live oak, or gold-cup oak, Quercus chrysolepis, a sturdy mountaineer of a tree, growing mostly on the earthquake taluses and benches of the sunny north wall of the valley. In tough, unwedgeable, knotty strength, it is the oak of oaks, a magnificent tree. The largest and most picturesque specimen in the valley is near the foot of the Tenaya Fall, a romantic spot seldom seen on account of the rough trouble of getting to it. It is planted on 3 huge boulders, and yet manages to draw sufficient moisture and food from this craggy soil to maintain itself in good health. It is 20 feet in circumference, measured above a large branch between 3 and 4 feet in diameter that has been broken off. The main knotty trunk seems to be made up of craggy granite boulders like those on which it stands, being about the same color as the mossy, lichened boulders, and about as rough. 2 moss-lined caves near the ground open back into the trunk, one on the north side, the other on the west, forming picturesque, romantic seats. The largest of the main branches is 18 feet and 9 inches in circumference, and some of the long pendulous branchlets droop over the stream at the foot of the fall, where it is gray with spray. The leaves are glossy yellow-green, ever in motion from the wind from the fall. It is a fine place to dream in, with falls, cascades, cool rocks lined with hypnum 3 inches thick, shaded with maple, dogwood, alder, willow, grand clumps of lady ferns where no hand may touch them, light filtering through translucent leaves, oaks 50 feet high, lilies 8 feet high in a filled lake basin near by, and the finest libocedrus groves and tallest ferns and goldenrods. In the main river canyon, below the vernal fall, and on the shady south side of the valley, there are a few groves of the silver fir, Abies concolor, and superb forests of the magnificent species round the rim of the valley. On the tops of the domes is found the sturdy, storm-enduring red cedar, Juniperus occidentalis. It never makes anything like a forest here, but stands out separate and independent in the wind, clinging by slight joints to the rock, with scarce a handful of soil inside of it, seeming to depend chiefly on snow and air for nourishment, and yet it has maintained tough health on this diet for 2,000 years or more. The largest hereabouts are from 5 to 6 feet in diameter, and 50 feet in height. The principal riverside trees are poplar, alder, willow, broad-leaved maple, and Nuttall's flowering dogwood. The poplar, Populus trichocarpa, often called balm of Gilead from the gum on its buds, is a tall tree, towering above its companions and gracefully embowering the banks of the river. Its abundant foliage turns bright yellow in the fall, and the Indian summer sunshine sifts through it in delightful tones over the slow-gliding waters when they are at their lowest ebb. Some of the involucres of the flowering dogwood measure 6 to 8 inches in diameter, and the whole tree when in flower looks as if covered with snow. In the spring, when the streams are in flood, it is the whitest of trees. In Indian summer the leaves become bright crimson, making a still grander show than the flowers. The broad-leaved maple and mountain maple are found mostly in the cool canyons at the head of the valley, spreading their branches in beautiful arches over the foaming streams. Scattered here and there are a few other trees, mostly small, the mountain mahogany, cherry, chestnut oak, and laurel. The California nutmeg, Torreya californica, a handsome evergreen belonging to the yew family, forms small groves near the Cascades a mile or two below the foot of the valley. End of Chapter 5.
The Yosemite by John Muir. Chapter 6a. The forest trees in general. For the use of the ever-increasing number of Yosemite visitors who make extensive excursions into the mountains beyond the valley, a sketch of the forest trees in general will probably be found useful. The different species are arranged in zones and sections, which brings the forest as a whole within the comprehension of every observer. These species are always found as controlled by the climates of different elevations, by soil, and by the comparative strength of each species in taking and holding possession of the ground. And so appreciable are these relations, the traveler need never be at a loss in determining within a few hundred feet his elevation above sea level by the trees alone. For, notwithstanding some of the species range upward for several thousand feet and all pass one another more or less, yet even those species possessing the greatest vertical range are available in measuring the elevation, inasmuch as they take on new forms corresponding with variations in altitude. Entering the lower fringe of the forest, composed of Douglas oaks and Sabine pines, the trees grow so far apart that not 1/20th of the surface of the ground is in shade at noon. After advancing 15 or 20 miles toward Yosemite, and making an ascent of from 2,000 to 3,000 feet, you reach the lower margin of the main pine belt, composed of great sugar pine, yellow pine, incense cedar, and sequoia. Next, you come to the magnificent silver fir belt, and lastly to the upper pine belt, which sweep up to the feet of the summit peaks in a dwarfed fringe, to a height of from 10 to 12,000 feet. That this general order of distribution depends on climate as affected by height above the sea is seen at once, but there are other harmonies that become manifest only after observation and study. One of the most interesting of these is the arrangement of the forest in long curving bands, braided together into lace-like patterns in some places and outspread in charming variety. The key to these striking arrangements is a system of ancient glaciers. Where they flowed, the trees followed, tracing their courses along the sides of canyons, over ridges, and high plateaus. The cedar of Lebanon, said Sir Joseph Hooker, occurs upon one of the moraines of an ancient glacier. All the forests of the Sierra are growing upon moraines, but moraines vanish like the glaciers that make them. Every storm that falls upon them wastes them, carrying away their decaying, disintegrating material into new formations, until they are no longer recognizable without tracing their transitional forms down the range from those still in process of formation in some places, through those that are more and more ancient and more obscured by vegetation and all kinds of post-glacial weathering. It appears, therefore, that the Sierra forests indicate the extent and positions of ancient moraines as well as they do belts of climate. One will have no difficulty in knowing the nut pine, Pinus sabiniana, for it is the first conifer met in ascending the range from the west, springing up here and there among Douglas oaks and thickets of ceanothus and manzanita, its extreme upper limit being about 4,000 feet above the sea, its lower about from 500 to 800 feet. It is remarkable for its loose, airy, wide-branching habit and thin gray foliage. Full-grown specimens are from 40 to 50 feet in height and from 2 to 3 feet in diameter. The trunk usually divides into 3 or 4 main branches about 15 or 20 feet from the ground that, after bearing away from one another, shoot straight up and form separate summits. Their slender, grayish needles are from 8 to 12 inches long, and inclined to droop, contrasting with the rigid, dark-colored trunk and branches. No other tree of my acquaintance, so substantial in its body, has foliage so thin and pervious to the light. The cones are from 5 to 8 inches long, and about as large in thickness. Rich chocolate brown in color, and protected by strong, down-curving nooks, which terminate the scales. Nevertheless, the little Douglas squirrel can open them. Indians climb the trees like bears and beat off the cones or recklessly cut off the more fruitful branches with hatchets, while the squaws gather and roast them until the scales open sufficiently to allow the hard-shell seeds to be beaten out. The curious little Pinus attenuata is found at an elevation of from 1,500 to 3,000 feet, growing in close groves and belts. It is exceedingly slender and graceful, although trees that chance to stand alone send out very long, curved branches, making a striking contrast to the ordinary grove form. The foliage is of the same peculiar gray-green color as that of the nut pine, and is worn about as loosely, so that the body of the tree is scarcely obscured by it. At the age of 7 or 8 years, it begins to bear cones and whorls on the main axis, and as they never fall off, the trunk is soon picturesquely dotted with them. Branches also soon become fruitful. The average size of the tree is about 30 or 40 feet in height and 12 to 14 inches in diameter. The cones are about 4 inches long and covered with a sort of varnish and gum, rendering them impervious to moisture. No observer can fail to notice the admirable adaptation of this curious pine to the fire-swept regions where alone it is found. After a running fire has scorched and killed it, the cones open and the ground beneath it is then sown broadcast with all the seeds ripened during its whole life. Then up spring a crowd of bright, hopeful seedlings, giving beauty for ashes and lavish abundance. The sugar pine, king of pine trees. Of all the world's 80 or 90 species of pine trees, the sugar pine, Pinus lambertiana, is king, surpassing all others, not merely in size, but in lordly beauty and majesty. In the Yosemite region, it grows at an elevation of from 3,000 to 7,000 feet above the sea, and attains most perfect development at a height of about 5,000 feet. The largest specimens are commonly about 220 feet high and from 6 to 8 feet in diameter, 4 feet from the ground, though some grand old patriarch may be met here and there that has enjoyed 6 or 8 centuries of storms and attained a thickness of 10 or even 12 feet, still sweet and fresh in every fiber. The trunk is a remarkably smooth, round, delicately tapered shaft, straight and regular as if turned in a lathe, mostly without limbs, purplish-brown in color and usually enlivened with tufts of a yellow lichen. Toward the head of this magnificent column, long branches sweep gracefully outward and downward, sometimes forming a palm-like crown, but far more impressive than any palm crown I ever beheld. The needles are about 3 inches long in fascicles of 5, and arranged in rather close tassels at the ends of slender branchlets that clothe the long, outsweeping limbs. How well they sing in the wind, and how strikingly harmonious an effect is made by the long cylindrical cones depending loosely from the ends of the long branches. The cones are about 15 to 18 inches long and 3 in diameter. Green, shaded with dark purple on their sunward sides. They are ripe in September and October of the second year from the flower. Then the flat, thin scales open and the seeds take wing, but the empty cones become still more beautiful and effective as decorations, for their diameter is nearly doubled by the spreading of the scales, and their color changes to yellowish-brown while they remain, swinging on the tree all the following winter and summer, and continue effectively beautiful even on the ground many years after they fall. The wood is deliciously fragrant, fine in grain and texture and creamy yellow, as if formed of condensed sunbeams. The sugar from which the common name is derived is, I think, the best of sweets. It exudes from the heartwood where wounds have been made by forest fires or the axe, and forms irregular, crisp, candy-like kernels of considerable size, something like clusters of resin beads. When fresh it is white, but because most of the wounds on which it is found have been made by fire, the sap is stained and the hardened sugar becomes brown. Indians are fond of it, but on account of its laxative properties, only small quantities may be eaten. No tree lover will ever forget his first meeting with the sugar pine. In most pine trees there is the sameness of expression which to most people is apt to become monotonous, for the typical spiral form of the conifers, however beautiful, affords little scope for appreciable individual character. The sugar pine is as free from conventionalities as the most picturesque oaks. No two are alike, and though they toss out their immense arms in what might seem extravagant gestures, they never lose their expression of serene majesty. They are the priests of pines and seem ever to be addressing the surrounding forest. The yellow pine is found growing with them on warm hillsides, and the silver fir on cool northern slopes, but, noble as these are, the sugar pine is easily king, and spreads his arms above them in blessing while they rock and wave in sign of recognition. The main branches are sometimes 40 feet long, yet persistently simple, seldom dividing at all, excepting near the end, but anything like a bare cable appearance is prevented by the small, tasseled branchlets that extend all around them. And when these superb limbs sweep out symmetrically on all sides, a crown 60 or 70 feet wide is formed, which, gracefully poised on the summit of the noble shaft, is a glorious object. Commonly, however, there is a preponderance of limbs toward the east, away from the direction of the prevailing winds. Although so unconventional when full grown, the sugar pine is a remarkably proper tree in youth, a strict follower of coniferous fashions, slim, erect, with leafy branches kept exactly in place, each tapering in outline and terminating in a spiry point. The successive forms between the cautious neatness of youth and the bold freedom of maturity offer a delightful study. At the age of 50 or 60 years, the shy, fashionable form begins to be broken up. Specialized branches push out and bend with the great cones, giving individual character that becomes more marked from year to year. Its most constant companion is the yellow pine. The Douglas spruce, libocedrus, sequoia, and the silver fir are also more or less associated with it, but on many deep-soiled mountainsides, at an elevation of about 5,000 feet above the sea, it forms the bulk of the forest, filling every swell and hollow and down-plunging ravine. The majestic crowns, approaching each other in bold curves, make a glorious canopy through which the tempered sunbeams pour, silvering the needles, and gilding the massive boles and the flowery, park-like ground into a scene of enchantment. On the most sunny slopes, the white-flowered, fragrant chamaebatia is spread like a carpet, brightened during early summer with the crimson sarcodes, the wild rose, and innumerable violets and gilias. Not even in the shadiest nooks will you find any rank, untidy weeds or unwholesome darkness. In the north sides of ridges, the boles are more slender, and the ground is mostly occupied by an underbrush of hazel, ceanothus, and flowering dogwood, but not so densely as to prevent the traveler from sauntering where he will, while the crowning branches are never impenetrable to the rays of the sun, and never so interblended as to lose their individuality. End of Chapter 6a. The Yosemite, by John Muir. Chapter 6, Part B. The yellow or silver pine. The silver pine, Pinus ponderosa, or yellow pine, as it is commonly called, ranks second among the pines of the Sierra as a lumber tree, and almost rivals the sugar pine in stature and nobleness of port. Because of its superior powers of enduring variations of climate and soil, it has a more extensive range than any other conifer growing on the Sierra. On the western slope it is first met at an elevation of about 2,000 feet, and extends nearly to the upper limit of the timberline. Thence, crossing the range by the lowest passes, it descends to the eastern base and pushes out for a considerable distance into the hot, volcanic plains, growing bravely upon well-watered moraines, gravelly lake basins, climbing old volcanoes, and dropping ripe cones among ashes and cinders. The average size of full-grown trees on the western slope where it is associated with the sugar pine is a little less than 200 feet in height and from 5 to 6 feet in diameter, though specimens considerably larger may easily be found. Where there is plenty of free sunshine and other conditions are favorable, it presents a striking contrast in form to the sugar pine, being a symmetrical spire formed of a straight round trunk clad with innumerable branches that are divided over and over again. Unlike the Yosemite form, about 1/2 of the trunk is commonly branchless, but where it grows at all, close 3/4 or more is naked, presenting then a more slender and elegant shaft than any other tree in the woods. The bark is mostly arranged in massive plates, some of them measuring 4 or 5 feet in length by 18 inches in width, with a thickness of 3 or 4 inches, forming a quite marked and distinguishing feature. The needles are of a fine, warm, yellow-green color, 6 to 8 inches long, firm and elastic, and crowded in handsome, radiant tassels on the upturning ends of the branches. The cones are about 3 or 4 inches long and 2½ wide, growing in close, sessile clusters among the leaves. The species attains its noblest form in filled-up lake basins, especially in those of the older Yosemites, and as we have seen, so prominent a part does it form of their groves that it may well be called the Yosemite pine. The Jeffrey variety attains its finest development in the northern portion of the range, in the wide basins of the McCloud and Pitt rivers, where it forms magnificent forests scarcely invaded by any other tree. It differs from the ordinary form in size, being only about half as tall, in its redder and more closely furrowed bark, grayish-green foliage, less divided branches, and much larger cones. But intermediate forms come in which make a clear separation impossible, although some botanists regard it as a distinct species. It is this variety of ponderosa that climbs storm-swept ridges alone and wanders out among the volcanoes of the Great Basin. Whether exposed to extremes of heat or cold, it is dwarfed like many other trees, and becomes all knots and angles, wholly unlike the majestic forms we have been sketching. Old specimens, bearing cones about as big as pineapples, may sometimes be found clinging to rifted rocks at an elevation of 7,000 or 8,000 feet, whose highest branches scarce reach above one's shoulders. I have often feasted on the beauty of these noble trees when they were towering in all their winter grandeur, laden with snow, one mass of bloom. In summer, too, when the brown staminate clusters hang thick among the shimmering needles, and the big purple burrs are ripening in the mellow light. But it is during cloudless windstorms that these colossal pines are most impressively beautiful. Then they bow like willows, their leaves streaming forward all in one direction, and when the sun shines upon them at the required angle, entire groves glow as if every leaf were burnished silver. The fall of tropic light on the crown of a palm is a truly glorious spectacle, the fervid sun flood breaking upon the glossy leaves in long lance rays, like mountain water among boulders at the foot of an enthusiastic cataract. But to me, there is something more impressive in the fall of light upon these noble silver pine pillars. It is beaten to the finest dust and shed off in myriads of minute sparkles that seem to radiate from the very heart of the tree as if like rain, falling upon fertile soil, it had been absorbed to reappear in flowers of light. This species also gives forth the finest wind music. After listening to it in all kinds of winds, night and day, season after season, I think I could approximate to my position on the mountain by this pine music alone. If you would, catch the tone of separate needles climb a tree in breezy weather. Every needle is carefully tempered and gives forth no uncertain sound, each standing out with no interference excepting during head gales. Then you may detect the click of one needle upon another, readily distinguishable from the free wind-like hum. When a sugar pine and one of these species, equal in size, are observed together, the latter is seen to be more simple in manners, more lively and graceful, and its beauty is of a kind more easily appreciated. On the other hand, it is less dignified and original in demeanor. The yellow pine seems ever eager to shoot aloft, higher and higher. Even while it is drowsing in autumn sun gold, you may still detect a skyward aspiration, but the sugar pine seems too unconsciously noble and too complete in every way to leave room for even a heavenward care. The Douglas spruce. The Douglas spruce, Pseudotsuga douglasii, is one of the largest and longest-lived of the giants that flourish throughout the Maine pine belt, often attaining a height of nearly 200 feet and a diameter of 6 or 7 feet. Where the growth is not too close, the stout, spreading branches, covering more than half of the trunk, are hung with innumerable slender, drooping sprays, handsomely feathered with the short leaves which radiate at right angles all around them. This vigorous tree is ever beautiful, welcoming the mountain winds and the snow as well as the mellow summer light, and it maintains its youthful freshness undiminished from century to century through 1,000 storms. It makes its finest appearance during the months of June and July, when the brown buds at the ends of the sprays swell and open, revealing the young leaves, which at first are bright yellow, making the tree appear as if covered with gay blossoms, while the pendulous bracted cones, 3 or 4 inches long with their shell-like scales, are a constant adornment. The young trees usually are assembled in family groups, each sapling exquisitely symmetrical. The primary branches are whorled regularly around the axis, generally in 5s, while each is draped with long, feathery sprays that descend in lines as free and as finely drawn as those of falling water. In Oregon and Washington it forms immense forests, growing tall and mast-like to a height of 300 feet, and is greatly prized as a lumber tree. Here it is scattered among other trees or forms small groves, seldom ascending higher than 5,500 feet, and never making what would be called a forest. It is not particular in its choice of soil, wet or dry, smooth or rocky. It makes out to live well on them all. 2 of the largest specimens, as we have seen, are in Yosemite. One of these, more than 8 feet in diameter, is growing on a moraine, the other, nearly as large, on angular blocks of granite. No other tree in the Sierra seems so much at home on earthquake taluses, and many of these huge boulder slopes are almost exclusively occupied by it. The incense cedar. Incense cedar, Libocedrus decurrens, already noticed among the Yosemite trees, is quite generally distributed throughout the pine belt without exclusively occupying any considerable area, or even making extensive groves. On the warmer mountain slopes it ascends to about 5,000 feet, and reaches the climate most congenial to it at a height of about 4,000 feet, growing vigorously at this elevation in all kinds of soil, and, in particular, it is capable of enduring more moisture about its roots than any of its companions excepting only the sequoia. Casting your eye over the general forest from some ridge-top, you can identify it by the color alone of its spiry summits, a warm yellow-green. In its youth, up to the age of 70 or 80 years, none of its companions forms so strictly tapered a cone from top to bottom. As it becomes older, it oftentimes grows strikingly irregular and picturesque. Large branches push out at right angles to the trunk, forming stubborn elbows and shoot up parallel with the axis. Very old trees are usually dead at the top. The flat, fragrant plumes are exceedingly beautiful. No waving fern frond is finer in form and texture. In its prime, the whole tree is thatched with them. But if you would see the Libocedrus in all its glory, you must go to the woods in midwinter when it is laden with myriads of yellow flowers about the size of wheat grains, forming a noble illustration of nature's immortal virility and vigor. The mature cones, about 3/4 of an inch long, borne on the ends of the plumy branchlets, serve to enrich still more the surpassing beauty of this winter-blooming tree goldenrod. The silver firs. We come now to the most regularly planted and most clearly defined of the Maine forest belts, composed almost exclusively of 2 silver firs, Abies concolor and Abies magnifica, extending with but little interruption 450 miles at an elevation of from 5,000 to 9,000 feet above the sea. In its youth, Abies concolor is a charming symmetrical tree with its flat, plumy branches arranged in regular whorls around the whitish-gray axis, which terminates in a stout, hopeful shoot, pointing straight to the zenith, like an admonishing finger. The leaves are arranged in 2 horizontal rows along branchlets that commonly are less than 8 years old, forming handsome plumes, pinnated like the fronds of ferns. The cones are grayish-green when ripe, cylindrical, from 3 to 4 inches long and 1½ to 2 inches wide, and stand upright on the upper horizontal branches. Full-grown trees in favorable situations are usually about 200 feet high and 5 or 6 feet in diameter. As old age creeps on, the rough bark becomes rougher and grayer, the branches lose their exact regularity of form, many that are snow-bent are broken off, and the axis often becomes double or otherwise irregular from accidents to the terminal bud or shoot. Nevertheless, throughout all the vicissitudes of its 3 or 4 centuries of life, come what may, the noble grandeur of this species, however obscured, is never lost. The magnificent silver fir, or California red fir, Abies magnifica, is the most symmetrical of all the Sierra giants, far surpassing its companion species in this respect, and easily distinguished from it by the purplish-red bark, which is also more closely furrowed than that of the white, and by its larger cones, its more regularly whorled and fronded branches, and its shorter leaves, which grow all around the branches and point upward instead of being arranged in 2 horizontal rows. The branches are mostly whorled in fives and stand out from the straight red-purple bole in level, or in old trees in drooping collars, every branch regularly pinnated like fern fronds, making broad plumes, singularly rich and sumptuous-looking. The flowers are in their prime about the middle of June, the male red, growing on the underside of the branches in crowded profusion, giving a very rich color to all the trees, the female greenish-yellow, tinged with pink, standing erect on the upper side of the topmost branches, while the tufts of young leaves, about as brightly colored as those of the Douglas spruce, make another grand show. The cones mature in a single season from the flowers. When mature, they are about 6 to 8 inches long, 3 or 4 in diameter, covered with a fine gray down and streaked and beaded with transparent balsam, very rich and precious-looking, and stand erect like casks on the topmost branches. The inside of the cone is, if possible, still more beautiful. The scales and bracts are tinged with red, and the seed wings are purple with bright iridescence. Both of the silver firs live between 2 and 3 centuries when the conditions about them are at all favorable. Some venerable patriarch may be seen heavily storm-marked, towering in severe majesty above the rising generation, with a protecting grove of hopeful saplings pressing close around his feet, each dressed with such loving care that not a leaf seems wanting. Other groups are made up of trees near the prime of life, nicely arranged as if nature had culled them with discrimination from all the rest of the woods. It is from this tree, called red fir by the lumbermen, that mountaineers cut boughs to sleep on when they are so fortunate as to be within its limit. 2 or 3 rows of the sumptuous plushy-fronded branches, overlapping along the middle, and a crescent of smaller plumes mixed to one's taste with ferns and flowers for a pillow, form the very best bed imaginable. The essence of the pressed leaves seems to fill every pore of one's body. Falling water makes a soothing hush, while the spaces between the grand spires afford noble openings through which to gaze dreamily into the starry sky. The fir woods are fine sauntering grounds at almost any time of the year, but finest in autumn, when the noble trees are hushed in the hazy light and drip with balsam, and the flying, whirling seeds, escaping from the ripe cones, mottle the air like flocks of butterflies. Even in the richest part of these unrivaled forests, where so many noble trees challenge admiration, we linger fondly among the colossal firs and extol their beauty again and again, as if no other tree in the world could henceforth claim our love. It is in these woods the great granite domes arise that are so striking and characteristic a feature of the Sierra. Here, too, we find the best of the garden meadows full of lilies. A dry spot a little way back from the margin of a silver fir lily garden makes a glorious campground, especially where the slope is toward the east with a view of the distant peaks along the summit of the range. The tall lilies are brought forward most impressively like visitors by the light of your campfire, and the nearest of the trees with their whorled branches tower above you like larger lilies, and the sky seen through the garden opening seems one vast meadow of white lily stars. End of Chapter 6, Part B.